On Monday, November 13th, 1961, the lookout of the oil tanker the Gulf Lion, bound for Puerto Rico, spotted an odd sight in the middle of the vast northwest Providence Channel in the Bahamas. Amongst the many waves and whitecaps in the distance, the lookout peered into the horizon and saw a small wooden dinghy and a man waving from within it. Tied to the dinghy was a life raft with something inside, but it was not yet visible from that distance. As the Gulf Lion drew nearer to the dinghy, the man occupying it called out, quote, "My name is Julian Harvey. I am master of the ketch Bluebelle. I have a dead baby here. I think her name is Terry Jo Duperrault," referring to the mound in the life raft. The story that came next was one that was truly unbelievable. After being rescued, Julian told the crew of the Gulf Lion that he was the sole survivor of the sinking of the Bluebelle, a 60-foot twin-masted sailing ketch partaking on a Caribbean cruise which had been victim to a sudden squall in the night before, dismasting the boat and causing it to sink into the sea. Taking with it to its watery grave were the other 6 passengers on board, the Duperault family on a once-in-a-lifetime vacation around the Caribbean, and Julian's own wife, Mary Denny. An extensive search by air and sea was launched, but no other survivors were found. After being rescued, Captain Julian Harvey was taken to Nassau in the Bahamas before being flown back to his hometown of Miami the following day. Julian's tale of his near-death experience was gripping and miraculous to all who heard it. But as Julian recounted the events to the Coast Guard in Miami on Thursday, November 16th, an even more miraculous discovery was made. One member of the Duperault family had survived and was found floating alone in the sea just hours earlier in a small cork and canvas float no bigger than a shallow bathtub. Her name was Terry Jo Duperrault, and she was only 11 years old. In fact, the body that Julian believed he had pulled from the water after the Bluebelle sinking was Terry Jo's younger sister, 7-year-old Renee Duperault. Terry Jo had floated alone in the sea without food or water for 4 days and 3 nights. On the very edge of death, Terry Jo had been spotted, by some miracle, by Second Officer Nicholas Bakidakis of the Greek freighter Captain Theo, which had been passing through the northwest Providence Channel bound for Texas from Belgium. Neither survivor knew the other was alive, and when their stories recounting the events of the 13th were compared, something was not what it seemed. What really happened on the night the Bluebelle sank? The truth will shock you. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jacqueline. You guys, this case deals with my worst fear and scared me to my literal core. I am terrified of deep, dark water, and this story is absolutely full of it. So this was a tough one for me to get through. If you are like me, then this case comes with a deep, dark water warning. Today's case is all about 11-year-old Terry Jo Duperrault and the sinking of the sailboat, the Bluebelle, in the middle of the sea. I know I say this every time, you guys, but this case has so many twists and turns, I got dizzy reading about it. The majority of my research is from the book Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean, and is written by Richard Logan, PhD, and Terry Jo Duperrault Fassbender herself. You guys, this 11-year-old girl survives alone in the middle of the sea for 4 days without food or water. Her story is unreal. Please subscribe to my channel, like and share this video so one day I can live my dream and make this my full-time job. Okay, let's dive in. Arthur Duperault had loved the sea ever since he had sailed the waters of the Pacific during his time in the Navy throughout the Second World War. Now a successful optometrist from Green Bay, Wisconsin, his dream was to take his family on a voyage around the world, stopping at various islands and ports along the journey. He wanted his wife and 3 children to love the sea as he did, and he had finally become prosperous enough in his career in 1961 to make that voyage happen. Arthur, his wife Jean, eldest son Brian, middle child Terry Jo, and youngest child Renee were well off and lived a comfortable life. So Arthur decided that he and his family would spend the winter of 1961 on the warm waters of the Caribbean instead of freezing on the edges of Lake Michigan. After countless hours of research, clipping magazines, and eyeing yachts and local ads, he settled on and financed the Bluebelle, quote, a 2-masted sailboat with a 60-foot-tall mainmast towards the bow and a shorter 45-foot mizzenmast towards the stern. Originally built as a racing yacht, the boat was long, low, and narrow. The plan was to take it for a 1-week test run and then, if the family got along well in such a confined space, finance the cruise for the full year. Arthur took his children out of school on the promise they could study during the voyage and found someone to take over his optometry practice for the year. His dreams were coming to fruition. The family arrived in Fort Lauderdale in early November 1961, where they chartered the 60-foot ketch stationed at the Bahia Mar Marina. The boat was owned by a man named Harold Pegg, and it was through Harold that Arthur hired 44-year-old Julian Harvey, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, veteran bomber, and fighter pilot, to be the Bluebelle's skipper. A skipper is just another name for the captain of a ship. Julian also loved to sail, and after his retirement from the Air Force had moved to Florida and signed on to be the official charter skipper of the Bluebelle. Now he would sail Arthur and his family around the world for $100 a day, along with his wife Mary Denny, who would cook and clean for the Duperaults. Arthur Duperault excelled in pretty much everything he tried his hand at. After graduating high school and attending Lawrence University, he dropped out to join the Navy and fight in World War II. Being only 5'8", he balled himself up so that he'd be accepted, which would turn itself into a lifelong fitness devotion. It was in the Navy that Arthur fell in love with the ocean. It was nothing like the cold waters of Lake Michigan where he grew up. Due to his time during the war, Arthur was no stranger to adventure and danger, riding through jagged trails in Southeast Asia and tending to men suffering from malaria, dysentery, and the wounds of war as a medic. He was later assigned to the Pentagon in 1944, where he met Jean Brosh, a secretary at FBI headquarters in Washington. He courted her at every opportunity, and the faster conventions of war-era dating saw them married in December of that same year. A perfect match, Arthur naturally quiet, with Jean being energetic and animated. After being discharged in November 1945, they moved back to Wisconsin and spent a few years living with Arthur's parents. Here in 1947, they had their firstborn, Brian. Arthur decided to go back to school and complete his education in optometry in 1949. Afterwards, he and Jean set out on their own, welcoming newborn Terry Jo the next year, and Renee 4 years after that. Arthur then hit it big with his optometry practice after taking a gamble selling a product that had only just been invented, the contact lens. At the time of these events, Brian entered his first year at Preble High School in Green Bay. He was, quote, small for his age, with even his younger sister Terry Jo being taller than him. The children teased him, calling him Shrimp, which led him to enroll in judo classes to bulk up. Jean was a born and raised farm girl from Nebraska who was quite progressive for the time. She liked to introduce her family to new and exotic foods like pig's feet, fried green tomatoes, and avocados. A yacht trip and avocados? Imagine being able to afford either of those things. She was slender and stylish with dark features and a stunning smile. She loved to have girls' nights out and socialize outside the home unattended in a time where that wasn't the norm for women. Not much is known about Renee, the youngest, as she was only 7 and had barely begun to live before her tragic death. She was, like many girls her age, quiet, shy, girly, and loved to play with dolls and put on dresses. Quite the opposite of Terry Jo. Terry Jo was the tallest of the bunch and was a self-proclaimed tomboy and loner. She was in 6th grade at Wequiok Elementary and loved the outdoors. Terry Jo had a big love for animals and owned many pets, including, quote, several rabbits, 2 dogs, and 5 cats. She would bring home rescue animals and even had a pet cemetery for those that passed in her care. She was imaginative and would create fantasy adventures when she would play outside. She would pretend to be surviving in the jungle, making forts, and even going so far as to create a, quote, Tarzan-inspired fur loincloth using skins of rabbits and squirrels she had found dead in the woods, which is serious commitment. I used to play house as a kid, but I never actually took out a mortgage. Terry Jo and her siblings were very excited about sailing with their parents, and they looked forward to the trip, counting the days until their voyage began. November 8th, 1961 finally arrived, and the Bluebelle left the Bahia Mar Marina with Captain Julian Harvey at the helm and all other 6 passengers taking in the view. The Bluebelle was a ketch, which is a, quote, 2-masted sailboat whose main mast is taller than the mizzen mast or aft mast. Essentially, the mizzen mast is the shorter mast directly behind the main one and is located close to the rear of the ship in front of the cockpit. The Bluebelle was fully rigged, meaning it carried 3 sails, the mizzen, a main, and a jib, which is a smaller triangular sail located just forward of the main. There were benches located at the sides of the cockpit for people to sit on, and the steering wheel was located at the rear center of it. The main cabin below could be accessed by the cockpit through a companionway or latched door to the right of the mizzenmast. Off the main cabin were sleeping quarters, a washroom, engine room, and storage. The forward cabin, where the skipper and his wife would sleep, was only accessible by a door at the very front of the ship near the base of the mainmast. Julian Harvey was 44 at the time the Bluebelle sailed that November. He was now retired from his military service and had just recently moved to Fort Lauderdale. During his career, he had received both, quote, the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal for actions as a B-24 bomber pilot in World War II, and he had flown the charismatic F-86 Sabre jet in the Korean War. Don't ask me what any of those numbers mean, but that's what he did. Despite his talents in the air, his true calling was out at sea. After retiring and moving to Florida, he pursued his dream of being the captain of a sailing yacht. He frequented all the local marines and yacht clubs and was said to always have a beautiful woman on his arm. Julian was, even in his 40s, extremely handsome and fit. He was said to look like a model, quote, not only was Harvey the most dashing of figures, even at age 44, the former jet jockey still more than looked the part. Straight from central casting, he looked the ideal of the heroic fighter pilot, movie star handsome with a shock of blonde hair and a broad, boyish smile. He was so handsome, in fact, that it was rumored he had worked as a male model. Julian's only imperfections seemed to be an occasional stutter made more evident at times of stress and a lazy eye. Julian Harvey married his 6th wife, Mary Denny, age 24, on July 26, 1961, just a few months before embarking on the voyage with Arthur Duperault and his family. When the Bluebelle left Fort Lauderdale on Wednesday, November 8th, it was en route to Bimini Island in the Bahamas, the closest island to Florida from the east, and where the Duperault family would take their first stopover. Sadly, the weather created delays, and the Bluebelle was not able to pull into the marina until 5 p.m. after the customs offices had closed, which rendered them unable to gain entry into the Bahamas. The family was forced to stay the night on the Bluebelle and try again the following morning. But for some unknown reason, the next day, Thursday, November 9th, Julian did not present his papers to the customs office and instead sailed the Duperault family several hours north toward a small islet called Great Isaac Key that housed basically just one lighthouse. It was just west of this islet that Julian and the Duperault family spent their second night at sea. On the morning of Friday, November 10th, the Bluebelle sailed due east to Sandy Point, a township located on the southwestern tip of the Bahamian island Great Abaco. During rest periods, the family would take the dinghy out and sail around the reefs, snorkel, and go fishing, quote, the sea was wild with color from horizon to horizon, like a stained glass window. Terry Jo, the already outdoorsy 11-year-old, marveled at the sights she saw. The beautiful fish, the birds swooping into the water to catch their prey, and the many different shades of blue and green the sea reflected. This was a world that the family from Wisconsin was not accustomed to, and the warm waters were a far cry from Lake Michigan. The family loved every minute of it. After exploring the turquoise waters of the Great Bahama Bank for a little while, Julian finally presented his papers to the commissioner's office, and the party went ashore for the first time throughout their voyage. Arthur Duperault fell so in love with Sandy Point that he, quote, told Village Commissioner Roderick W. Pinder he planned to build a vacation home there. Although Julian was quite late in presenting his papers, during the 1960s, the Bahamian authorities were less rigid about making sure one presented their papers to the commissioner's office firsthand, and leniency would be given to American boats dropping anchor off their coasts to take advantage of their beaches. While ashore, some family members went to the post office to mail letters to relatives about their travels thus far. Mary Denny, Julian's wife, wrote a letter to her mother in which she jokingly complained about the lack of privacy aboard the Bluebelle, when she wrote, quote, I think I'll devise some kind of disappearing act. Why, oh why, can't people leave me alone? At this point, I'm ready to shoot myself. Mary Denny also wrote that she didn't like having to get up at the crack of dawn to cook breakfast for the Duperault family, but concluded that she thought the Duperaults were lovely people and the children were very well behaved. Upon leaving the commissioner's office, Julian ran into an old sailing companion of his, Napoleon Roberts. Napoleon Roberts. That's his real name? That's a great name. And Julian invited him to dinner on the Bluebelle that night to meet the party and his wife. Napoleon would recount sometime later that everyone seemed to be having a good time. They were happy and relaxed. The morning of Saturday, November 11th, Julian sailed the Bluebelle to the small island northwest of Sandy Point called Gorda Key, now known as Castaway Key, for some swimming, fishing, and other sun endeavors. It was unclear whether the party slept in the harbor at Gorda Key until the morning of the 12th before heading back to Sandy Point, or if the party didn't arrive back at Sandy Point until very early in the morning and slept for a few hours there in the harbor. But regardless, early Sunday morning, November 12th, Julian went back to the commissioner's office to fill out the required forms to leave Bahamas and start the journey back to Florida. One thing was certain. The trial vacation was a success, and Arthur planned to take his family back out for a longer voyage as soon as possible. Before leaving Sandy Point, Arthur befriended a local fisherman and invited him on board the Bluebelle for a chicken cacciatore dinner. These guys refused to leave the Bahamas until everybody comes on board for dinner. The fisherman happily agreed, saying, quote, everyone on the Bluebelle was nice and having a wonderful time. It was a happy ship. This, however, would be the final meal ever eaten on the Bluebelle. The following day, Monday, November 13th, Julian Harvey was found in the middle of the sea by the crew of the Gulf Lion towing the rubber life raft behind his dinghy with the body of 7-year-old Renee Duperault inside. During the night, a sudden squall had demasted the Bluebelle, causing it to sink, leaving him as the only survivor. Julian was taken to Nassau in the Bahamas and was put on a flight back to Miami the following day. He was then instructed to attend a formal hearing inquiring into the sinking of the Bluebelle and the deaths of all other 6 passengers, including his wife, 2 days later, Thursday, November 16th. The investigation was held by Lieutenant Ernest Murdoch and the Coast Guard Captain Robert Barber, and was held in the Calumet building located in the Miami Business District. When Julian entered, he seemed to be in good spirits. This surprised everyone considering what he had just gone through, losing not only his wife, but being responsible for an entire family who died under his watch as skipper of the Bluebelle. Julian took it upon himself to press for information about survivors or any wreckage of the Bluebelle, but none had been found. Lieutenant Ernest Murdoch explained to Julian that the reason for the inquiry was to determine, quote, the cause of the Bluebelle's loss and whether any incompetence, misconduct, or law violations contributed to the disaster. Julian was then placed under oath and requested to recount the events of what happened. This account was recorded in the official transcript of the hearing. Julian starts by describing the proceedings of what happened the night of Sunday, November 12th. I have shortened some sections for efficiency, but all the text is as it is in the transcript. Quote, "We set sail from Sandy Point on the east side of the Providence Channel shortly after dark Sunday night. It was our intention to stop for a few hours in the lee of Great Stirrup Key, get 3 to 4 hours of sleep, then proceed to Great Isaac, anchor in the lee for a little more sleep, then reach Fort Lauderdale Tuesday night or Wednesday morning. When we left Sandy Point, the weather was good. There was a fresh breeze coming up, about 15 knots. I had the staysail up and the mainsail up. I did not have the mizzen or the flying jib up. Under this sail configuration, the Bluebelle could easily carry 25 or 28 knots of wind without heeling over uncomfortably. In other words, that was a very safe conservative sail plan." Julian continued, now going more into detail about the weather, quote, "There were a few small rain squalls in the area. We encountered one of them about halfway between Sandy Point and Great Stirrup Key. Because it had been such pleasant sailing, with no power on, everyone was in the cockpit. It was a big, roomy cockpit. The children were there with some minor bedding and were napping." Julian's stutter became more evident now, quote, "Then this small squall hit us, and a monstrous thing happened. In a 20-knot wind, the main mast failed 1/4 or 1/3 of the distance above the deck. It was not a failure of stays, it was a failure of the wood in the mainmast. A 50-foot length of the mainmast came hurtling straight down, piercing the deck like it was made of paper. It was just like a telegraph pole going straight down on the deck. It tore through the 1-inch white pine of the deck and continued on down through the bottom of the hull. As it gained momentum, the stays from the mainmast to the mizzenmast gave a gigantic pull to the mizzen, breaking it in at least 2 places. The mizzenmast collapsed among us in the cockpit. This collapse of the entire rig reduced us to a bare hull wallowing in the sea. Stays are, quote, strong cables that run front and behind the mast tops to the bow and stern, and from one mast to another. These support the mast longitudinally. All these ropes on the ship are under a great amount of tension, especially given the added tension from the wind, so a failure of the mast could potentially force everything downwards, including other masts. Also, the abrupt relief of tension would cause the rigging to whip around violently, damaging anything in its way. As Julian Harvey continued his story, his stutter got progressively worse, quote, "Fortunately, no one was hit directly by the falling mizzen, but my wife and Dr. Duperault were cut on the legs by splinters. I was steering at the time, and I started the engine and left it at a slow ahead to give us control. I briefly checked the wounded and told everybody to sit fast and not to panic, that I was going forward to get the cable cutters and get rid of all the cables around us. I ran forward, clearing my way through the debris, went below in the forecastle, which is the front part of the upper deck, and finally got the cutters. Emerging from the forecastle forward, I saw that a fire had started in the cockpit area, and because the wind was down the deck, fore to aft, or front to back, the 6 passengers were moving aft, or away, back from the flames into the fantail, which is the small section of deck to the rear of the cockpit. As they were standing on the rear deck behind the cockpit, very close to the gasoline tanks located under the rear deck, I was naturally in deadly fear of an explosion. I ran below, picking up 2 5-pound fire extinguishers. The water was already a foot deep in the cargo container coming through the hole made by the mainmast. Julian went on to state that flames were coming up through the vents in the cockpit and that the cockpit was surrounded by fire, which was spreading quickly across the deck, which, quote, had been painted with a highly flammable neoprene. He stated that the fire extinguishers did little to help by this point. The boat was beginning to sink, so Julian launched the dinghy and rubber life raft. Julian said it was then that he saw the rest of the passengers jump overboard, presuming he would come back and get them with the dinghy and the life raft, rather than facing the fire on the ship. I could hear faint yells, Julian continued, although the Bluebelle and I were going into the wind and they were downwind of me. I tied the raft and dinghy together and rowed to the stern, or back. It was pitch dark and I could see nothing in the water. Julian continued saying that he shouted into the night for the rest of the passengers, but no one answered back. He was exhausted and his voice was raspy from yelling. The Bluebelle had sunk below the surface now, and it was dark all around him. It was then that the body of little Renee Duperault, the 7-year-old whom Harvey had mistaken for the body of Terry Jo, floated face down in the water beside his dinghy. He grabbed her and pulled her into his dinghy with his last ounce of strength and began to try resuscitating her, but it was no use. He put her body in the raft, which was tied to the dinghy, and remained in the area a little while longer to see if he could find any more survivors or bodies. The night was cold, but luckily daylight broke shortly after and brought warmth. He decided to open the rations he had with him, but consumed them sparingly as he feared the southeast wind would drift him into the Gulf Stream and then northward into the Atlantic. Luckily for Julian, at about 1300 hours or 1 p.m., he saw the steamer Gulf Lion heading towards him and he was rescued. After Harvey's story about the events that took place on the night of November 12th, and all questions were asked, it was time for Harold Pegg, the owner of the Bluebelle, to testify. Just as Harold began, Captain Barber rushed into the hearing with shocking news. News that would take the men in that room and the world by storm. As Julian Harvey had been recalling the events of the Bluebelle's sinking in Miami, Second Officer Nicholas Bakadakis scanned the blue waters of the Northwest Providence Channel from the deck of the freighter ship the Captain Theo. Bound from Belgium to Texas, it was Nicholas's turn to be on watch. As he looked out at all the, quote, tiny dancing white caps in the distance, he noticed that one white cap didn't seem to disappear like the rest of them. He assumed it was a piece of debris at first and paid it no mind, but something about it intrigued him and he kept coming back to it. He knew it couldn't be a fishing dinghy because none could be out that far, so he called Captain Stylianos Koutsadontis to the bridge. The white object was approximately 1 mile from the starboard bow, and as the Captain Theo sailed closer, the crew were stunned to see what it was. Not debris, but in fact a little white life float. To their complete disbelief, sitting inside the life float, alone in the great open sea, was a little blonde-haired girl. As she saw the crew aboard the Captain Theo, she looked up at them and gave them a weak little wave. She was wearing pink capri pants, or pedal pushers as they were known in the 60s, and a white blouse. She was sitting across the shortest section of the life float, widthwise, so that she wouldn't fall through the middle opening. This famous picture was taken by one of the crewmen aboard at the time and would eventually be on the front cover of almost every North American magazine to follow. Captain Stylianos immediately ordered a small raft to be deployed and rescue the girl, but then he saw a terrifying sight and ordered the crew to move as fast as possible. Sharks were circling the little girl, quote, perhaps attracted by the commotion, or maybe they had been stalking her for who knows how long. But they were closing in on the little girl, surrounding her feet, which were dangling in the water. When the raft reached the little girl, she was pulled on board, falling completely limp in the crew's arms. She looked as if she had been alone on the water for quite some time, quote, her lips were puffy, her skin badly burned, her cheeks sunken, her hair bleached almost white by the tropical sun, and her eyes were dull and unseeing. When one of the crewmen tried to stand her on the deck, her legs crumbled beneath her. She had no strength whatsoever. She was slowly given sips of water and orange juice, and the crew gently used a cool sponge to wet her face and body. Vaseline was also applied to her lips, which were completely cracked and red. Captain Stylianos tried asking the girl her name and how she found herself in the water, but she did not respond. She was blank and didn't seem to have much awareness to the goings-on around her. Eventually, after asking many more times if she had family he could reach out to, the little girl gave a feeble thumbs-down motion indicating to the captain that she must have been the only survivor of some disaster. When asked if anyone else was alive out in the water, the girl shook her head but whispered the word Bluebelle. When asked what her name was, she again whispered, "Terry Jo Duperrault," into the captain's ears before falling back into unconsciousness. Then Captain Stylianos telegraphed the Coast Guard in Miami, quote, "Picked up blonde girl, brown eyes, from small white raft, suffering exposure and shock, named Terry Jo Duperrault, was on Bluebelle." It was this incredible news that Captain Robert Barber had rushed into the boardroom and interrupted Julian Harvey's hearing with. Julian was now not the only survivor of the Bluebelle sinking, and this little girl had gone 4 days without food or water, floating on a life raft the circumference of a bathtub, all alone, in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. She was 11 years old. As Captain Stylianos put it, quote, "You would not have been able to see the raft at a distance of more than 1.5 miles at the most from my bridge, which was 50 feet above the water. It was a miracle that we chanced to see her." Given where Terry Jo and Julian Harvey had been picked up, the wind conditions, and the ship's origin point the night of the 12th, the Coast Guard could estimate where the Bluebelle might have sunk. They then set out a search team to look for more survivors and the ship itself, but none were found. Terry Jo was airlifted from the Captain Theo to Mercy Hospital in Miami, where Dr. Franklin Verdon awaited on the landing pad. She remained there in a coma until she better recovered. When Julian heard the news after Captain Barber rushed into the hearing, announcing Terry Jo had been recovered and was expected to make a full recovery, he proclaimed, quote, "Oh my God, isn't that wonderful?" Getting up from his chair, he then walked over to a window, looked out the window for a brief moment, then proceeded to leave the room. When asked if he wanted to stay to hear Harold Pegg's testimony, Julian shook his head, flashed a small smile at Lieutenant Murdoch, and left. After Julian left the room, Lieutenant Murdoch and Captain Barber placed a call to the Miami Police Department asking that a guard be placed outside Terry Jo's hospital room. As it turned out, Julian Harvey's account of what happened the night the Bluebelle sank didn't add up, and there were, quote, "too many holes in it." They didn't know what exactly Julian was hiding, but now, quote, "Terry Jo was the only person known to be alive who could corroborate or contradict his account of the Bluebelle's fate." The following day, a cleaning lady knocked on the door of room 17 at the Sandman Motel on Biscayne Boulevard. After several attempts without response, the cleaning lady unlocked the room and went inside for the daily room service. She noticed an odd odor from within the room, but didn't think much of it. She had smelled many an odd smell cleaning rooms before. The sheets on one of the twin beds were crumpled, and she noticed there was a small streak of blood on one of them. She then went to collect the dirty towels in the washroom, but couldn't get the door to open. It wasn't locked, but there was something blocking the door from opening. She immediately noticed the smell was more intense from within the bathroom, and when she looked down, she saw large pools of blood on the bathroom tile by the door. She screamed until the motel manager heard and came to investigate. Try as he did, he was also unable to push the door open due to the dead weight holding it partially closed. Police were called, and at 12:14 p.m. on Friday, November 17th, patrol arrived at the scene. After several tries, an officer was finally able to push the door to the bathroom open enough to peer his head inside and look around. He saw, quote, "A blood-covered body was sprawled face up on the tiled floor. The body had been slashed violently to death." The officer, having previously been a Miami Harbor patrolman, recognized who it was immediately, exclaiming, quote, "That's Julian Harvey." Based on the evidence at the scene and the time of death, police were able to piece together what they believed happened to Julian Harvey. Here is their reconstruction of the events leading to his death. After Julian left the hearing the previous day, he left his car parked on the street nearby and took a cab to the motel, checking in under the name John Monroe at 11 a.m. His only luggage was a suitcase he had taken from his car and a small paper bag. This was the last time anyone saw Julian Harvey alive. Julian drank throughout the night, and in the early morning hours placed the empty whiskey bottles from the paper bag neatly in the wastebasket. He then began to write a goodbye letter to his friend from the Air Force named James Boozer. Julian wrote that he loved his 14-year-old son Lance, and that he wanted adoption arrangements to be made, giving custody to a Miami family that had been looking after him. "I am a nervous wreck," Julian wrote, and just can't continue. I'm going out now. I guess I either don't like life or don't know what to do with it. Nowhere in Julian's letter did he reference the Bluebelle and the events that took place during its final hours. After sealing the envelope, he wrote on the back, quote, "Cremate and bury at sea." Then, for unknown reasons, Julian scratched out the word cremate and underlined bury at sea. The envelope was carefully placed in the center of the desk, and next to it was a picture album holding photographs of his life. He had also folded his clothes and hung them neatly in the closet. It was first thought that Julian planned to kill himself on the bed, hence the splotch of blood on the sheets. But something made him change his mind, put his trousers back on, and move to the washroom. A $10 bill was left pinned to a pillow, perhaps as a last apology to the maid who would inevitably find his body. Before going to the bathroom, Julian took 2 photographs from the photo album and placed them upright on the toilet so that he could see them. They were of his son Lance and his wife Denny. Then, Julian began to slash himself. Please note this next section is very graphic and some may want to skip ahead, quote, Julian finished what he had started to do. He proceeded to slash his ankles, his wrists, his forearms, his thighs, and then even both sides of his neck. He was slashed so badly that deep muscle had been laid open to the bone in his thigh and his body had been drained of blood. No one had ever seen so many cuts or such extremely deep ones on a suicide before. Hardened police officers gaped in amazement at the gory scene. The cuts Julian made to his body were so violent and deep that it was wondered at first if this was a homicide. Everyone who saw the body could not imagine the resolve it would take to inflict that kind of trauma to oneself, quote, officers shuddered to think of a man cutting and recutting and recutting with a small blade all the way through his muscular thigh to the thigh bone. It also did not look like a suicide driven by extreme sadness or grief, despite the pictures of his deceased wife Denny and distant son propped up on the toilet. It was too overkill and appeared to stem from a deep self-hate. What could possibly have made Julian Harvey despise himself so much that he felt he might only find absolution in a violent, punishing death, especially when the discovery of Terry Jo meant that there was hope for more survivors? Or was Terry Jo a ghost come to life to confront him about something? What did Julian know that the world didn't? James Boozer, Julian's good friend and the one he addressed the goodbye letter to, felt that he had the answer. After Julian's rescue, when he was brought back to Miami from Nassau, Julian had told James the story of what happened the night the Bluebelle sank, the same version he had been telling everyone, but James didn't believe it was the whole truth. In fact, neither the Coast Guard, the lieutenant, or the crew of the Gulf Lion truly believed Julian's account of what happened. There were just too many holes in his story, and the events just didn't add up. Julian eventually opened up and told James his truth. James would later recount that during Julian's retelling of the events, his stutter was the worst he had ever seen it, and that his lazy right eye was moving around in all directions with his eyelid batting up and down. With a heavy heart, Julian asked James to swear on his son's life that he would never repeat his story, and then began, quote, when the main mast snapped and the mizzen fell among us, it knocked Denny and Doc overboard. I lost my nerve when I saw the blood and guts on the deck and jumped overboard, abandoning the ship. The next thing I knew, I was pulling the little girl into the boat with me. Remember, Jim, you're my friend. You took a vow. This version of the story would explain why Julian felt such overwhelming guilt. He had not been the brave hero he had claimed to be, and had not tried to rescue everyone on board. Instead, he had saved himself like a coward and left his wife and the Duperault family to die. James Boozer inevitably broke his promise to Julian and told Lieutenant Murdoch and Coast Guard Robert Barker this story after hearing of Julian's vicious suicide. But he did it in an attempt to save Julian's reputation from the rumors of a story far worse. Once this version of the story made its way around, many people believed it was motive enough to account for Julian's suicide, but not everyone was convinced. Now, only one survivor remained to finally set the story straight, and she was an 11-year-old little girl. But due to her prolonged sun exposure and lack of food and water, Terry Jo was under threat of organ failure, pneumonia, or heart fibrillation. She was also extremely dehydrated and had kidney damage, quote, "She had gone just about as long as a human being could go without water, 4 days, and still live." Despite all this, she made a swift recovery but was under strict orders by her doctors not to speak to authorities or journalists until she was believed to be strong enough mentally to manage what she had gone through. By November 19th, she was eating and speaking again like normal, but she spoke very little of her family, and doctors were concerned that she did not grasp her situation fully. Finally, Dr. Verdon believed it was time for Terry Jo to speak with the Coast Guard about what happened. And this was the moment that everyone who had come to know about the sole survivor had waited for. So, sitting up in her hospital bed, surrounded by gifted flowers, cards, stuffed animals, and dolls, she spoke about what she remembered. It was suspected, given that on the Captain Theo she had motioned a thumbs down gesture when asked about any other survivors from the Bluebelle, that she understood she was the only survivor. But to what extent did she comprehend? She also was not informed of Captain Julian Harvey's rescue and later suicide, to avoid any influence on her accounts. Coast Guard Captain Robert Barber began, quote, "Terry, can you tell us if everything went well and if it was a happy trip until the night of the accident?" Terry Jo: "Yes, everything was okay." Captain Barber: "Now, this is a difficult part to tell us about, but would you, in your own words, as best you can, tell us what happened that night on the Bluebelle? I know it's difficult." Terry Jo then began to tell a very different story of the events that took place on the night of November 12th, 1961. According to Terry, around 9 p.m. the Sunday night, she went to bed in her small sleeping cabin, located behind the main cabin, and fell asleep. Renee normally slept there with her, but had remained upstairs on the deck with their mother that night. Although she can't be sure what time exactly, sometime later in the evening, Terry Jo said she was awoken by the sound of a, quote, loud screaming voice from inside the boat. The voice was screaming, quote, "Help, Daddy, help!" And she recognized it to be the voice of her brother Brian. She also heard the sound of frantic running and stamping noises. Then silence. Stunned and terrified, Terry Jo remained in bed, too afraid to move. After 5 to 10 minutes of silence, she slowly got up to see what was going on, creeping out of her stateroom. But when she opened the door, she saw her mother Joan and brother Brian, quote, lying crumpled in the main cabin, a pool of blood collecting on one side of the cabin floor. At first, Terry Jo thought she might be having a nightmare, but soon the reality of the situation hit her. Her brother and mother were both dead, each having been stabbed. She began to climb the companionway stairs to the deck of the ship and peered her head out the opening hatch that faced onto the cockpit. She only saw more blood pooled on the right side of the cockpit and a knife. As she began to leave the hatch door and turn around towards the front of the ship, she saw Julian Harvey rushing towards her. As she began asking what was happening, she saw, quote, his right eye rolling hideously. Julian then struck Terry Jo and pushed her back down the hatch opening into the main cabin, yelling, quote, "Get back down there." Terrified, Terry Jo went back to her cabin, averting her eyes to the dead bodies of her mother and brother, and huddled under the bed covers. Soon she started to hear the sound of sloshing water and wondered if Julian was washing blood up on the deck. Then she started to smell oil and noticed that oily water was flooding into her cabin. Terry remained frozen in fear. Suddenly, she saw Julian standing in the doorway, mostly in shadow. He was holding something that spanned across his body, but she couldn't make out what it was. Neither of them moved, and Terry could hear Julian's labored breathing as he stood there looking at her. Then he turned and walked away, climbing the stairs back up to the deck. Next, Terry heard loud, irregular hammering noises coming from somewhere within the boat, and the oily water was now spilling over the top of her mattress. She knew she had to leave the cabin, despite her fear of whatever she would face up on deck. She left her bed, wading through oily water waist high, until she found the companionway stairs and climbed up them. Her mother and brother now floating in the water that flooded the main cabin. As Terry looked around the deck, she could see that the ship's dinghy and rubber life raft had been launched, and were bobbing up and down on the port side of the ship, or the left side. She then saw Julian and yelled, quote, "Is the ship sinking?" To which Julian replied that it was. Julian then forcefully handed Terry Jo the line to the dinghy, screaming at her to hold it, as he went to the front of the ship gathering other supplies. Stiff from shock, Terry Jo accidentally let the line slip from her fingers and fall overboard. It was clear that Terry Jo had interrupted Julian as he was planning his escape from the boat. Nowhere had Terry Jo seen her father or Mrs. Harvey since waking up, and she couldn't see them anywhere on the deck or in the dinghy. When Julian returned, he yelled, "The dinghy's gone!" and dove into the water after it as it drifted away from the Bluebelle. Terry Jo watched helplessly as Julian swam away, leaving her alone on the wave-washed deck. In the dark of the night, she never saw if he ever reached the dinghy. Abandoned and frightened, Terry Jo was left standing on the deck, and the ship was sinking quickly around her. As she stood there, she wondered about her father and why she had not seen him. Where could he be? Had he jumped overboard? The realization that she had to get off the ship came back to her, and she remembered there was a small 5-foot by 2-foot white cork float that was, quote, kept lashed to the right side of the top of the main cabin, which was still just barely above water. Terry Jo scrambled to the float, over a deck now awash in water. Keeping herself calm enough to work with deliberate speed, she carefully pulled the right end of each rope, undid each knot, and worked the float loose. Terry Jo half swam, half crawled to the bow or front of the ship and climbed into the cork float just as the bow sank into the water. Now the ship was gone, her family was gone, Julian and his wife were gone, and Terry Jo was alone in the darkness in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. When asked by Captain Robert Barber if she knew what Julian was holding when he stood in her cabin doorway, Terry Jo said she believed it to be the rifle that they had brought with them for the trip. Before the disaster of the sinking, Terry Jo said there was no negativity on board or animosity amongst anyone. She never heard anyone arguing with Captain Julian Harvey and had never seen him angry before that night. Many other questions would be asked of Terry Jo in regard to her account, with an emphasis put on whether she recalled the state of the masts when she had found her way above deck. If Julian's story was true, there would be rigging and fallen masts all over the deck. It would have been chaotic, quote Barber. Terry, when you first went up on deck, did you notice any damage to the rigging wire, the stays holding the masts up? Terry Jo, all the wires were perfect. Barber, Mr. Harvey told us that when the main mast fell down, this dragged over the mizzen mast. The rigging between dragged over the mizzen mast, which fell down and struck the deck. Did you notice the mizzen mast down on the deck? Terry Jo, the mainsail was all wrinkled and going all over, and the mast was leaning. I wasn't sure if the mizzen was up, but I think it was. Barber, you mean that the masts were up, but the sails were all slack? Is that correct? Terry Jo, the masts were up, yes. Barber, you didn't see any damage or broken part on the mast, did you? Terry Jo, no. Barber, and you know that when you are sailing, the wind holds the sails firm and not fluttering. Do you understand that? Terry Jo, yes. Barber, now you say when you first came up on deck that night, the sails were loose and fluttering. Terry Jo, yes. Barber, and did you mean that the mainsail was partway down, or just it was loose and fluttering? Terry Jo, it was partway down. Barber, Terry, did you see anything on the deck that looked like there had been trouble? Terry Jo, I saw blood on the deck near the cockpit. Barber, did you at any time hear something that might have been a gunshot? Terry Jo, no. It was speculated that Julian must have lowered the mainsail in a hurry and had not stowed it correctly, resulting in it going all over as indicated by Terry Jo. This was so that the Bluebelle would, quote, lie dead in the water in order for Julian to put the dinghy and life raft over the side. Terry Jo was pressed several times about the condition of the masts on deck when the Bluebelle went down, being asked if they were upright, had fallen, or if the rigging had been damaged, but each time, Terry Jo maintained adamantly that nothing was broken or damaged on deck. Terry Jo went on to explain that the deck was still well lit at this time due to the masthead light, which is a light used to make the boat visible to other vessels at night, and the floodlights, which are attached near the top of the mast and point downward onto the deck. Because of this, she was able to see the entire cabin top, the deck on either side of the cabin top, and much of the forward part of the deck beyond the cabin. This meant that the masts were undamaged and intact, unlike in the story that Julian told. Terry Jo was asked if she ever saw or smelled fire aboard the ship that night, and she said no. There hadn't been any fire or smoke, but she did smell oil. This again disproved Julian's claim that a fire broke on deck when he had gone to grab wire cutters in the bow, separating himself with the rest of the passengers in the cockpit. She also recounted that the sea was calm that night, and only a brief shower rained down on her after the Bluebelle sank. Terry Jo told Captain Robert Barber that after waking from the screams, she had never seen her father, Mrs. Harvey, or her younger sister Renee. This raises many questions. If they were alive, where had they been? If they were already dead, how had they died, and where were their bodies? If they had been killed, had Julian thrown them overboard, or perhaps hidden them in the forward cabin so they couldn't be found? The longer Terry Jo told her story, the more evident it became that Julian had lied, and there had been no accident on board the Bluebelle that night. Going back to the night the Bluebelle sank, Terry Jo, who was now floating alone in the sea, had, quote, escaped a sudden death at the hands of the captain and a slow death by drowning, trapped below decks in a sinking ship, only to be vulnerable now to a slower death from dehydration or to the horror of jaws striking from the dark depths. And no one in the universe knew she was there. It was a cold night and Terry Jo had no food, no water, and nothing to keep her warm. She was still afraid that Julian Harvey was out there and would find her, and she would have to see his wild, turning eye again. She, growing up in a religious household, asked God to protect her as she floated in the dark, moving up and down with the swells of the water. She was wearing only a light blouse and pink pedal pusher capri pants. The cork float had a netted rope bottom and was always 2 to 3 inches under the water, so at all times, Terry Jo was partly submerged in the sea. This wasn't always a bad thing, however, as at night, the sea water was warmer than the cold, biting wind, and in the heat of the sun, it cooled her body down somewhat. She tried not to think about the fact that this rope webbing was all that separated her from the seemingly bottomless and dark waters below. Along with the fear that she could run into Captain Julian Harvey at any moment was the hope that she would instead find her father. She never saw his body on the Bluebelle that night. As the sun rose that Monday morning, it helped calm and ease Terry Jo's fears. It was an odd juxtaposition. Although the night was dark and encompassing, the light of day illuminated how truly alone on the vast sea she was. As far as she could see, there was only water in all directions. Terry Jo found that she had to spend most of her time reclining widthwise on the cork float, because whenever she sat up, the light float threatened to tip over if her weight wasn't dispersed perfectly. These cork floats were never designed to be sat in, rather they were meant for people already in the water to hold on to for a short period of time. Terry Jo soon realized that the day brought with it new dangers as the intense heat began to cook her body, quote, on the shadeless sea, the air temperature quickly rose to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Terry Jo would try to submerge herself in the water to cool off as much as possible, but the more she did, the netting holding her up would begin to break. This exposed her body to the open water more, and soon Terry Jo had a new danger to worry about. Parrotfish began to bite and peck away at her legs and buttocks. Guys, look at the teeth on this fish. This is terrifying. This is a fish that looks like it chews. Terry Jo said they were always around her, biting her, but soon the fear turned to anger and she would swat at them. Terry Jo's skin began to burn and her lips collected salt from the water and increased her thirst, quote, exposure, dehydration, and heat exhaustion would soon begin to scramble her body chemistry. She was also getting hungry, and despite being in a sea full of food, she had no way to eat any of it. She saw sargassum float by her often and considered eating the little berries that were clumped together in the seaweed, but she was so thirsty that the idea of eating something salty turned her off the idea. As the sun set on her first day at sea, she began to feel the cold of the night again. She did manage to fall asleep for a little bit, only to be awoken by a sharp choking and sputtering, as she realized she had fallen off the cork float and was in the water. Luckily, her arm still clung to one side, which prevented the float from drifting away in the dark. Later that night, Terry believed she could hear water crashing on rocks, but given that she was being pushed by a southeastern wind westward, away from the Bahamian Islands, it was likely to have been a hallucination. During her second day at sea, she saw planes flying overhead, but they were too far above to see her. One plane, however, flew low enough that Terry Jo waved her arms frantically to signal it despite her weakened state. It circled her, giving her hope, but eventually flew off and away into the distance. Ironically, that plane was searching for survivors of the Bluebelle, as Julian Harvey had already been rescued by the Gulf Lion by this point. But none, including Terry Jo, were found. Terry Jo was floating in the Northwest Providence Channel, in the northmost spot of a very deep trench called the Tongue of the Ocean. Despite the shallow waters of the Bahamas being relatively gentle in the winter, swells over this deep trench could grow to 8 feet tall and higher. With winds pushing her into the Gulf Stream, if Terry Jo was not rescued soon, she would eventually be pushed north and then east again into the Atlantic towards the British Isles, where her chances of survival were essentially zero. At one point during the day, Terry Jo's float drifted through a large school of small fish that seemed to engulf her little float in the center of it. Terry Jo knew that sharks followed these schools, and she had at several times on the Bluebelle seen sharks and barracudas in the waters surrounding the ship. She was afraid her pink pants would attract these predators to her exposed bottom at the base of the netting, but at no time was she ever attacked by anything more than the parrotfish. And it is suspected that this is because she may have been protected in a surprising way. When Terry Jo had waded through the waist-high water in her cabin in the Bluebelle, it was covered with a layer of oil and gasoline, which ended up coating her pants as well. Similarly, when Terry Jo threw the cork float into the water beside the Bluebelle, it was also covered with a layer of oil and gas. This coating of oil and gas could have been a strong enough odor to disguise her scent from predators. Terry Jo was also visited by a pod of pilot whales, which are, quote, a species of large dolphin that grow to about 20 feet in length. And although they are predators, they predominantly hunt squid. In fact, Terry Jo was comforted by the presence of these, quote, gentle giants, and thanked God for sending them to her so that she wouldn't feel so alone. As night fell on Tuesday evening, the pain caused by the scorching sun on her burnt skin was relieved, but although her physical torment was eased, the mental anguish the night brought with it was overwhelming. Despite being able to sleep this night, Terry Jo had many nightmares. When day broke on Wednesday morning, the heat came with it quickly. Her eyes were dry and scratchy, and squinting for so many hours was painful. Her hunger was becoming very evident by now, and she had no moisture left in her body. All her muscles ached, and her skin burned. Her lips were completely puffed and swollen. Very little of the rope webbing under the cork float was left intact, and she had to use more of her strength to balance on it. She began to hallucinate regularly and even saw the proverbial desert island in the distance that housed one lonely palm tree, quote. She tried paddling toward it, but it disappeared. She slowly became delirious and finally lapsed into unconsciousness. Terry Jo barely lived through another night on the sea, and her body was going numb. She was beginning to forget where she was, and by this time, all her hunger had vanished. She no longer produced saliva, as her body was saving all its remaining fluids to fuel her vital organs. By this point, even if she had food, she wouldn't have been able to eat it because she no longer had digestive juices. As the heat of Thursday morning intensified, her body temperature rose with it to about 105 degrees. Terry Jo was unconscious for most of the day, but miraculously didn't fall off her float. Her brain was now shutting down, yet through her dying state she sensed something big around her, quote, a huge shadowy shape loomed before her like some great rumbling dark beast. When she looked to the top of the shadowy beast, she saw waving hands and arms. Then she faintly heard voices yelling, telling her to stay put. With all her remaining strength, she pulled herself to a seated position on the float and gently waved her hand back. She eventually felt herself being lifted and moved on to her rescue ship. So let's fast forward. Now Julian's account of what happened on the Bluebelle was widely considered to be a lie, and Bluebelle owner Harold Pegg attested to its safety. Before the ship sailed with the Duperault family on it, he had it inspected for safety, including the masts. Harold also maintained that the mast could not have fallen straight down, piercing the deck as Julian had claimed. Any wind that would have damaged the mast would have pushed it sideways and would have brought any attached rigging with it. Harold also didn't believe that there had been a fire on board. Even if there had been, Harold had shown Julian about a fire suppression system several times that, when pulled, would extinguish any fire in the engine room. This pulley was easily located in the cockpit. The crew of the Gulf Lion, the ship that picked Julian up from the water, also noted his peculiar attitude just after his rescue. Julian didn't act like a man who had just lost his wife, and never asked to send word to any of her relatives, or the relatives of the Duperault family, which at this time he believed had all died at sea. Julian also came across anxious that a search and rescue for the ship and any remaining survivors might actually find some. The Gulf Lion had planned to search the area for survivors just after Julian's rescue, but Julian unwaveringly asserted that none would be found and that the search would be, quote, fruitless, as he had already searched the area himself for hours. Julian also seemed relieved when no search was decided upon. Julian's testimony contradicted itself in many places. He told the Gulf Lion crew that Dr. and Mrs. Duperault had been killed by falling debris and there had been blood and guts everywhere, but in the formal hearing, they only received minor injuries. When asked by the crew why Julian had no blood on himself anywhere or on his clothes, he said that seawater had washed it off, but many were skeptical that seawater alone would wash all the blood out of his clothes. A bag of flares had also been found on the dinghy, which was suspicious as Julian had claimed in his testimony that he couldn't find flares. It is believed that he didn't use them because he didn't want to be found too close to where the Bluebelle went down. One crewman of the Gulf Lion believes he saw Julian throw a red gas can overboard his dinghy just before he had been rescued, and after the dinghy had been inspected, fresh motor blade marks were visible on its stern. This indicates that Julian had also had a small gas-fueled motor on the dinghy and was able to use it as propulsion for his escape, but had ditched it overboard before anyone could see it. This implies that he had a destination in mind to reach, or that he wanted to be far enough away from the wreckage as possible before being found. Other evidence that points to Julian having propulsion is the distance he traveled. When Julian had been found, it was estimated that he traveled approximately 8 miles in half a day, whereas Terry Jo traveled 18 miles in 3.5 days. This means that, quote, Julian traveled nearly half as far as Terry Jo in 1/7 the time, a rate over 3 times that of hers, and with a life raft trailing him, adding to his weight. When Julian had been rescued by the Gulf Lion, he had been given clean, fresh clothes to wear, and although Julian took the shirt and shoes, he refused to take off his dirty, salt-stained pants. Later, back on land, while Julian was staying in a hotel room, one of the hotel staff performing her rounds was startled to see in his room one of the beds, quote, covered with money, wet money that was drying out. She didn't know how much was there exactly, but claimed there was quite a lot, and in large increments too. They covered the entire top of the bed. It is believed that is why Julian refused to give up his pants for new ones. An old friend of Julian's would later share that Julian had a custom of concealing large cash amounts in the lining of his pants. Did Julian have a financial motive for killing everyone on board the Bluebelle? An anonymous call was made to the brother of Julian's wife, Mary Denny, telling him to, quote, check traveler's insurance, Miami. Lo and behold, a follow-up on this revealed that just before the voyage had begun, Julian had taken out a $20,000 policy on his wife's life, with himself being the beneficiary. It is also discovered that a, quote, double indemnity clause that meant a payoff of $40,000, about $350,000 today, if she died accidentally. In fact, Bluebelle owner Harold Pegg noticed scratch marks on Julian's arm after being rescued. Julian claimed he had gotten them from rigging and wires during the sinking, but Harold, who had worked with ships his whole life, knew what wire cuts looked like and maintained that those were not wire cuts. They were fingernail scratches. Money is now considered to be the motivating factor for the killings. So what exactly happened that night on the Bluebelle? This theory is taken from the book Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean by Richard Logan, Ph.D., and Terry Jo Duperrault, Fassbender. I should also mention it is important to remember that Julian and his wife's sleeping quarters were located at the front of the ship, separated by a wall at the head of the main bedroom. This forward cabin was only accessible through a large covered passageway on the forward deck. With the plan to kill his wife Denny for the insurance money and make it look like an accident, Julian stabs her in their cabin in the middle of the night while Arthur is at the wheel up on deck with his wife Jean Duperault and Renee in the cockpit. Julian plans to dump Denny's body overboard, weighing her down, then rendezvous with Arthur at the wheel. He would wake the next morning to find his wife gone and believe she fell overboard in the night. But things didn't go as planned and Denny fought back, leaving large fingernail scratches on Julian's arms before succumbing to the stab wounds and dying. Arthur, who was in the cockpit at the wheel, hears the commotion and heads to the front of the ship, only to be confronted by Julian wielding a knife. Julian stabs Arthur and he dies on the forward deck. Jean runs forward to help her husband but finds him dead, with Julian standing over him. She runs back to grab Renee but is stabbed by Julian, wounding her. During this, Renee hits her head and perhaps falls unconscious on the deck. Jean, wounded, stumbles and falls into the main cabin, dying on the floor. Julian now becomes increasingly agitated as his plan falls apart around him. He must now eliminate any witnesses and escape. Brian hears the commotion, gets out of bed, and sees his mother dead on the floor. He screams for his father's help, unknowing that Arthur is most likely already dead at this point. Julian stabs Brian and he falls beside his mother. Knowing he must now sink the ship, Julian goes into the engine room and opens the sea valves, allowing water to rush in. Julian then rushes back upstairs, tosses the knife in the cockpit, and drops the sails to deaden the boat in the water so he can launch the dinghy. Julian puts Arthur's body in the forward cabin where his wife's body is so that they will not float to the surface as possible evidence. At this point, Terry Jo, having woken to the sound of her brother's cries, comes through the companionway latch into the cockpit. She sees the knife and the blood. Julian runs at her and pushes her back down into the main cabin. Terry Jo runs back to her room and gets into the bed, fearful for her life. This is when she hears the hammering sound, which is suspected to be the launched dinghy banging against the side of the Bluebelle. The water splashing sound she hears is from the engine room. Julian goes below deck, grabs the rifle and any cash he can find, and stands in Terry Jo's doorway, contemplating shooting her. He decides that she will drown with the ship and goes back on deck. Terry Jo goes back on deck, is handed the line to the dinghy, and drops it in the water. Julian dives into the sea to get it and is not ever seen again by Terry Jo. Terry Jo scrambles to get the cork float and launches it into the water. A second theory less known about was brought forward by a Miami detective, although this one seems less credible. His theory is that the night of the mass killings, Julian had planned a rendezvous with drug smugglers in the middle of the night to transport narcotics and other contraband from Cuba into Florida, but this went awry. This theory was supported by the fact that Julian knew people involved in the drug trade and needed the money. This detective believes that Julian sent out a radio call just before midnight on Sunday, November 12th, giving out their location. This fact is supported by confirmation from a ham operator in the Bahamas at the time, however this cannot be confirmed. The detective believes that Dr. Duperault accidentally came back up on deck, having gone to his cabin, to find Julian involved with the drug smugglers. It is believed that this is when Julian panicked and struck Arthur, and a fight ensued, resulting in Arthur's death on deck. The drug smugglers pulled away and Julian was left to clean up the mess he had made alone. In this situation, Julian felt he needed to kill everyone else on board and fake as if a squall had hit them. This situation, although possible, seems less likely as it would be extremely risky to try and pull off such an exchange with 6 other passengers on the boat. There would have been too many unknowns that Julian would not have been able to plan for. However, it was discovered that the owner of the Bluebelle, Harold Pegg's 2 sons, had been involved in a, quote, minor drug smuggling operation for many years, dating back at least into the 1970s. The brothers had accumulated a fortune of around $46 million in this time, but were eventually caught. So, given Julian's close connection with Harold Pegg, could he have secretly been a part of this operation prior to the 1970s? I'll let you decide if this theory holds any water. So was Julian Harvey a cold-blooded killer who premeditated the murder of his wife for the insurance money? Remember that the two had only been married a short time before the incident occurred. Mary Denny's brother Harry believes this is the case. Harry disclosed that before their marriage, Julian had led Denny to believe that he was well off financially, when in fact he didn't have a penny to his name and was deeply in debt. This was discovered because after the Bluebelle tragedy, Harry hired a private investigator to look into Julian's history. Another chilling detail also came to light through this investigation. Harvey had a past history of surviving plane crashes and boat sinkings, and had told a friend that he could, quote, wreck it and make it look like an accident for the insurance money. So who was Julian Harvey? And when did he turn from a decorated war hero to the killer he supposedly became? During the war, when Army Air Corps needed brave men to test new planes and crash them on purpose to find their weak spots, Julian volunteered to be the pilot, saying, quote, you can count on me. I have what it takes. I will keep you safe. In the fall of 1942, Julian was ordered overseas to fly B-24s across the English Channel on bombing missions in Europe. During this mission, his plane was badly shot up, but, quote, rather than having his crew bail out, he managed to fly it back to England and landed safely. His entire crew survived. During the war, Julian Harvey had helped complete over 30 missions before returning to the U.S. in 1944. After the war, Julian finished his bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering while still working as an active Air Force officer. But clearly there are two sides to every person. In 1948, Julian, who was 31 at the time, met and married his third wife, 21-year-old Joan Boleyn. Their son, Lance, the one referred to in his suicide note, was born at the end of 1948. In 1949, while driving home from a movie with his wife and mother-in-law during a rainstorm, the car, quote, swerved sharply to the right, struck a bridge railing and flipped down a hill before going over a drop and into the water below. Due to his experience escaping downed airplanes, Julian was able to, mid-air, open his car door and jump out of the car before landing in the water and swimming to the shore. His wife and mother-in-law never surfaced and drowned trapped in the vehicle. Later, it was discovered that Julian had made no attempt to try and rescue his family and was completely nonchalant about the incident, instead, quote, boasting when he told how easy it was to get out of the airborne car. However, when divers went to retrieve the bodies of the two women, all the doors on the car were completely closed. Just the driver's seat window was open. It was determined that Julian must have gone into the water with the car and escaped out the window without bothering to assist his dying wife and mother-in-law. The crash was ruled an accident, but many suspected Julian had purposely driven the car off the bridge. Julian was married again to his fourth wife by 1951, however, this marriage would end in divorce soon later. A year or so later, Julian met and married his fifth wife, Georgiana, and shortly after that they bought the 60-foot yawl, the Torbatros. But on one of its earlier voyages, the Torby, as it was called, quote, ran aground on the wreck of the World War I battleship Texas in Chesapeake Bay and sank. Julian sued the federal government, claiming that the Texas wreck wasn't properly marked, and as a World War I vessel, the government was responsible for it. Although no one died, the Torby was destroyed, and Julian won $14,258, or about $176,308 in today's money, in a settlement along with the insurance money. Despite it appearing as an open and shut case, many passengers who were on board the Torby that day maintained that the Texas was in fact clearly marked, and that Julian seemed to run the ship directly into the wreckage to try and sink it. In the end, the Torby accident was ruled in favor of Julian's case, Between 1957 and 1958, Julian and Georgiana purchased another yawl, the Valiant, using the money they got from the Torby settlement, and used it to sail the Gulf Coast with Julian's son Lance. But their marriage was rocky and Georgiana filed for divorce in 1958. During this time, Julian sailed the Valiant to Cuba on a solo trip, but, would you know it, the ship burned up and sank just a few miles offshore. Julian, who was picked up by a passing boat, boasted about how he narrowly escaped the, quote, raging inferno. Once again, Julian received insurance money from the sinking, but a friend of his later came clean saying, quote, Julian told the Coast Guard a beautiful story. He was a real expert at storytelling because he had had so much experience talking himself out of trouble. He told me he set the fire himself because he was in a financial jam and needed the insurance money. This took place between 1958 and 1959. Only 2 years later, Julian would tell how the Bluebelle caught fire and everyone on board but himself died in the night on the Northwest Providence Channel in the Bahamas. As you can see, Captain Julian Harvey had a shady habit of casting off to sea and coming back without the boat. Whether that's bad luck or a good scam is unfounded. After the ordeal at sea, Terry Jo returned to Green Bay in 1961 to live with her aunt, uncle, their 3 sons, and her grandmother. One of the first actions she took was to reply to the hundreds of letters that were sent to her, offering her comfort from around the world. People around her were told not to talk to her about what she had gone through, not to make things uncomfortable for her, and it would take 19 years before Terry was able to really open up to anyone about her experience again. This included everyone around her, even family, friends, boyfriends, and psychotherapists. Terry Jo had lost her entire family in one night and didn't talk about it for almost 2 decades. One thing that Terry Jo did do as a way of giving herself a new start was, at age 12, changing her name from Terry Jo to just Terry. She also changed the spelling from Terry, Terry, to Tere. It was a small comfort that made a big difference for her healing. The Terry Jo that was linked to so much pain was gone, and a new Terry could live as more than just, quote, a survivor. At the time of writing this, Terry Duperault Fassbender lives on the shore of Lake Michigan with her husband Ron and dog Angel. She has 3 children, and they all live near one another. After her ordeal, Terry worked in the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources protecting the waterways, which was a bit of an homage to her late father, Arthur Duperault, who would have been proud to see she fought to protect shores from overdevelopment. From carefree vacationing to grim survival and 4 days lost at sea, Terry went through more horror than most people ever do in a lifetime. As for the Bluebelle and Julian Harvey, they unfortunately remain at the bottom of the sea, along with their secrets, and the full story about what happened that night. Okay, guys, that is the case of Terry Jo Duperrault and the Bluebelle. What are your thoughts on this wild case? Had you heard of this before? Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, help a girl out starting a new channel. Guys, like, subscribe, and share it so I can bring more crime deep dives to you faster. All I want to do is make videos for you. Help me make this my job. See you for the next case. Thank you again. My name is Jacqueline. Have a great night. Bye, guys.